So good afternoon, everyone. This is Dan Montez from the President's Office. I would like to welcome you to the pre-submission webinar for the 2021 Boettcher Webb-Waring Biomedical Research Awards program. We are joined today by the program selection panel's chair, Dr. Ron Sokol, and vice chair, Dr. Andrew Thorburn. Slide 2. Today you will get information about the program, the application process, and tips in completing your application, where to find key resources you may need, and then have an opportunity for some Q&A with Ron and Andrew. Before we begin, a couple basic tips on the Zoom webinar platform. After you've logged on, you should be seeing our main presentation screen and a live video of whoever is presenting. You will see our PowerPoint slides as we proceed. And then just as a note, if you go to the website, the BFWW website, you'll also be able to see today's slides on that website as well, that you can download yourself. Slide 4, you will notice a group of icons that includes chat, Q&A, and/or raise your hand. However, during today's webinar, the chat and raise hand features will be disabled. And even though the audio is one way, you can still ask questions anytime during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A icon. And then you will come on to the next screen on slide 5, where you will enter your question and select send on the Q&A screen. You will also have the option of including your name or just sending it anonymously. We'll go through your submitted questions during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to the chair of our selection panel, Dr. Ron Sokol.
Thank you, Dan and Jim. Welcome everybody to this webinar. Andrew Thorburn and myself will give you some basic information about the grant program and about the specific application. And then we will answer some frequently asked questions that we already have in our data bank. And then we will open it up to further questions. So again, thank you for joining us. I should mention that at the end of the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the website for this grant application procedure. And these slides, as well as other information, will be on that website. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that this is a wonderful program that is a partnership between the University of Colorado and the Boettcher Webb-Waring Foundation. The purpose of this is to award up to 5 grants of $235,000 of direct costs. This is for up to 3 years of research activity for promising and talented early career investigators at the University of Colorado. So it is possible to use this award for 2 years of funding if that suits your needs. But the total amount is $235,000, not the yearly amount. Each awardee will also be designated the prestigious title of a Boettcher investigator. And finally, eligible faculty researchers from all 4 CU campuses are eligible and encouraged to apply. And this is faculty researchers, not postdocs. Next slide. We wanted to stress a few items here. Some of these are changes this year, others are just points to emphasize. The first is that a career plan for the proposed investigator is a very important criteria for this award. Second is that the departmental commitment is important. So the career plan can be entered in the bio sketch under Section A or incorporated in some of the other documents that you need to submit. The departmental commitment is best put in the letter from your department or division chair stating specifically what space, other salary support, other resources that the department has committed to this early stage of your career. The third is that you should find ways to stress how this grant will help you progress to independence and accelerate your career. And this can be mentioned again in your mentor's letter, also in the departmental commitment letter and statement. And you can also mention this in section A of your bio sketch. Next slide. So here's the eligibility criteria. This is very important. You must be within 4 years of your appointment to a career track academic position, again, at one of our 4 CU universities and campuses. A career track appointment, therefore, must have begun on or after January 1st, 2016. So that's an important date. January 1st, 2016, your career track appointment, generally assistant professor, must have occurred after that date to be eligible. In general, these are faculty appointments that have a significant expectation for research, also with teaching and or clinical activities. And the position may be either a tenure track or a non-tenure track. Next. The second main criteria is that you have not previously received a major independent research award. And there's quite a bit of detail here that I need to go over so you understand what we mean by a major independent research award. So at the time of this application and the time of selection, that is when our review panel meets, we must reconfirm prior to submitting awardee names to the Boettcher Foundation on May 1st that you have not received a major independent research award. So if you did receive, and I'll tell you what those awards are in a second, if you received one between the time you submitted and May 1st, then you become ineligible. Now, major independent grant award includes an NIH R01 or similar grant. So you're ineligible if you have an award of an R01. If you have an R01 grant pending, so you're not certain whether it's going to be awarded, you may submit to this grant funding mechanism, the Boettcher Award. However, if you do get your award before May 1st, then you will relinquish the award if you were one of the chosen, or you will no longer be eligible regardless. Now, one other thing to mention is K99 R00 awards, which in the R00 component provide independent research support of at least $125,000. They are considered ineligible, even if you're in your K99 years, because you will soon have the R00, which is over $125,000. Now, this $125,000 limit is for direct costs only on your major independent award. And this award can be either a single year award for $125,000 a year or a multiple award for $125,000 per year. Therefore, that is the cutoff for direct costs. Now, if you have small independent awards that are each less than $125,000 in direct costs, but when you add all these awards together, it's more than $125,000, you are still eligible. So let me repeat that. If small awards total $125,000, but none of them are $125,000 or greater in direct costs, you are eligible. And therefore, training grants, K awards, mentored career development awards, and other type of awards that total less than $125,000, you remain eligible. So K01, K08, K23, generally those awards have less than $125,000 in direct costs, and you are eligible. Next slide. The third major criteria is you have received a terminal degree or completed your medical residency within the 10 years preceding the application. So your PhD is your terminal degree. For MDs that do not have a PhD, then their medical residency completion is the date at which the 10 years start counting. And when it says medical residency, that can be surgical residency, pediatric residency, any type of medicine residency. Therefore, the key date is January 1st, 2010, 10 years before this next January 21st. You must have received your terminal degree or completed your residency on or before that date. Dan, I'm looking at this. Should that be 2011, seeing that January 1st, 2021 will be when these applications are submitted? I just noticed that.
No, it is correct. It's January 1st, 2010. The 10-year timeline and the 4-year timeline earlier are based on when we announced the program, not when the awards are made.
Great.
So because we announced the program at the end of 2020, we can use that time frame back to 2010 rather than 2011.
Okay, this is really to everybody's advantage because it's really closer to 11 years than just 10 years. And then finally, the Boettcher Foundation has put in place a requirement that you must be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident at the time of submitting the application to apply. Next slide. So remember, you have to meet all 4 of these criteria to be eligible. Before you proceed with working on the application, you should determine your eligibility, and you can contact Dan Montez and the team at the email addresses below on the slide if you have any questions whatsoever. You must complete and sign the 2021 eligibility certification and verification form that is part of the application, and also your department chair or their representative must sign your form to verify your eligibility. So again, for any clarifications or questions, there is the website for this specific grant award. It's a cu.edu website, and you will get these slides. So you'll have that, website URL. You should also contact your campus grants and contracts offices because they will also have information for you. And finally, you can just email at web-waring@cu.edu to have specific questions answered. Very important, though, to establish your eligibility before you proceed. Next slide. So I'm going to turn this over to Andrew, who's going to talk about the actual application itself and give you some very helpful tips.
Okay, thank you, Ron. First, a disclaimer, many of the things that I'm going to suggest to you are going to apply to every grant that you submit in your career. However, some of these things are going to be somewhat selective and specific for this application. So, general tips. Please follow the instructions on the website. In the application package, there are pretty specific instructions. Please follow those instructions. We suggest very strongly that you treat this very similarly to a grant that you apply for through an agency like the NIH. You should use Arial 11 font, and somewhat different from the rules for federal grants from the NIH, we require that you have 1-inch margins. It's not such a good idea to use fancy formatting, for example, to make 2 columns or anything else that may make it difficult for a reviewer to read either on paper or on a screen. And remember, many of our reviewers review your grant based on a PDF that they're reading on their iPad. Next slide, please. The components of the application include the following. A cover letter from you. This should explain the goals of your research in a way that is suitable for a lay audience. Now remember that this research is health related and it has to be relevant for human health. We're going to potentially use the information in the text from your cover letter to talk to the Boettcher Foundation and other agencies about this. And so please make that suitable for a lay audience. Section 1 has a section where we ask you for the relevance to human health. Again, this should include lay terms and clearly explain the health relevance of the research. Section 2 has a scientific abstract. This should be a more detailed technical document that includes a real good summary of why you're doing the research, what you expect to find, and we strongly suggest that you include your specific aims explicitly in that scientific abstract. The reviewers will look at that early on, and Ron and I may use that information to assign reviewers to your particular grant. Section 3 has the investigator information. Please follow the BioSketch template, which is similar to, but not exactly the same as the standard NIH template. We strongly suggest that you remember that the personal statement section is your opportunity to explain why you're the best person in the history of the world to do this particular research. Don't just gloss over that piece. That's going to be read by your reviewers. You also want to use this area to explain to the reader how your project fits into your field. And then finally, in that personal statement section, it would be helpful if you would explain how this award will help you become an independent investigator. There's a career plan section that in the investigator information. This is an important criteria. We will ask the reviewers to review your career plan. So provide the reviewers with information that will be helpful to them to be persuaded that your career plan is going to be on track if you get this award. Next slide, please, Jim. The research plan has 6-page limit. The reviewers expect to see a grant that looks like an NIH type grant. So you should have clearly defined specific aims. You should include a background and significance section. This section should explain the health relevance as well as the scientific impact of the work. And this is your opportunity and the optimal place to establish the scientific rationale and the premise that underlie your proposal, and to persuade us that that is sound. It's helpful additionally to describe innovative aspects of your work here. The reviewers are likely to reward innovation, and if you can explain that, that's good. The approach should provide a specific plan that will include research design and methods, and the reader needs sufficient detail to understand what you're doing. And here it's important to remember that although all the reviewers are accomplished experts, they may not be experts in your specific field. So if you're a cardiovascular investigator, you may be getting reviewed, one of your reviewers may be a neuroscientist or a cancer biologist or a mathematician. You should explain what you're going to do in a way that an intelligent, experienced reviewer who is not in your specific field will understand what you're doing. Preliminary data is allowed, it's not necessary, but if it's available, we would strongly suggest that you provide it, for example, to establish feasibility of what you propose to do. If the project is going to develop pilot data that you expect will lead to future studies, you want to explain why that's valuable and what will be done with those data. You want to include in your approach section statistical justifications such as power analyses, and explain how data will be analyzed. You also need to justify the feasibility and numbers for any animal or human studies. And so, for example, if you're intending to carry out experiments using human subjects, this is the place where you should establish the feasibility of attaining the accrual numbers that you would need for your study. We will be looking for that information. Next slide, please. Our suggestion is that for the research plan to establish feasibility, you should ask yourself, have you shown that it's possible to do this? And then secondarily, can you do it with the expertise and facilities that you specifically have? We suggest you include an expected results section and discussion of potential pitfalls and alternative approaches. A timeline is optional, but that's often helpful, and many reviewers appreciate seeing how that's going to work out. It's particularly important if there's any question as to whether you could achieve this goal in the timeline that you will have. References are not included in the 6 pages, and we request that there are no more than 50 of them. The references are going to be part of the review. They will, and it's useful that you use them to demonstrate your knowledge of the literature and your capabilities. It's helpful if it's relevant to cite your own previous work. And if you do that, we suggest you make it clear to the reader that this is your previous work. Do not ignore important relevant studies, especially if they raise doubts about your work. So that's true in all grants. Next slide, please. The budget section, section 5, is a 2-page maximum. Break that up into components as in the instructions and explain how the budget supports your research plan in the budget justification. You don't need to give us the price of pipette tips, but you should justify your expenditures on a category basis for how you're going to spend the money. There are several assurances that are needed. You need to sign your form, and then the campus assurance form signed by others, including your department chair, need to be included. We ask for a maximum of 4 letters of recommendation. One of those should be from your department chair or division chief. And as Ron mentioned, that should include a description of your department's commitment to your research program, such as equipment, space, protected time, startup funds, etc. We realize that sometimes it can be a little bit delicate to go to your boss and say, this is what needs to be put in the letter, but you really do need to do that because some department chairs and division chiefs do not fully understand what we're looking for in those letters. We require that there be 1 letter from your mentor or advisor. So every junior faculty member at the University of Colorado has an official faculty mentor. So normally that would be that person, but either that person who's been formally appointed by your department chair or a similar mentor in the department or in a related department who should attest to your promise and abilities. And then we ask for 1 to 2 letters from researchers outside your institution who can address the merits of your science. In some cases, this could be someone, including your PhD mentor from the previous institution that you worked at. But in many cases, it's best if this is a person in your field who knows your work and knows your promise and can legitimately argue for your promise as an investigator in your particular field. It's really better if these people can make it clear that they know you and are familiar with your research. So the ideal person is someone who you're familiar with at another institution who's an expert in your field. And a maximum of 4 letters will be accepted. Next slide, please. So some of these hints are pretty obvious and are true for every grant, but we strongly suggest that you have a mentor or another experienced grant awardee and a person who's experienced at reviewing grants to read your proposal. What that means in reality is that you need to get your proposal ready early enough before the deadline that that person has time to do that. As I mentioned, you should not assume that the reviewers will be experts in your specific field, but you should realize that all of our reviewers are accomplished and successful researchers, and all of them are experienced at reading and reviewing research proposals. But because they may not be an expert in your particular field, it's really important that you remember that the reviewer needs to have the background biology perhaps explained to them in ways that you might not if you were going to a group of reviewers who know exactly what you're going to do. Many of our proposals are hypothesis driven, and we suggest that in that case, you make it clear how the work that you're going to do will test the hypothesis. However, if your work is not really hypothesis driven, if it's discovery research or other non-hypothesis driven research, you should explain how generating these data will actually move the field forward. Next slide, please. Ron, is this you now? Dan?
Yeah, this will be me. So we wanted to take a minute to just walk you through some of the key resources as you're preparing. All of the information and application materials will be available on the BFWW website. And at the top of this slide, you can see the URL for that. This will include information about the program, eligibility, and how to apply. Then if you click on that how to apply, you will get your campus-specific instructions and deadlines. And then this is where you'll access the application components, including forms and templates. This will be for application, eligibility, certification and verification, biosketch, budget, and campus assurances. You will also find a list of FAQs about the program on this page. And then lastly, a list of your campus contacts is also provided in the campus-specific instructions, and those names are provided here as well. And then with that, we wanted to kind of kick off the Q&A portion of this. We'll go to the next slide. And as we're processing some of your questions, we're also providing a couple of the more common questions that we get each year. And so we're going to begin with a couple of those. So the first question on the next slide for Dr. Sokol and Thorburn is, are the number of CU awards limited to a specific campus? We talked about 5 awards being awarded. Are they limited to a specific campus, or can they all go to the same campus?
I can answer that. As stated here, we don't really assign a certain number of awards to any specific campus. So theoretically, all awards could go to a single campus. What we do take into consideration is whether that campus supports by facilities, collaboration, expertise, equipment, can support the grant, but there is no restriction to the number of how many awards can go to any CU campus. So we're all competing against each other, not against each other's campuses.
Okay, thank you. Next question, is there any preference regarding basic science versus clinical studies?
Shall I do that one, Ron?
Sure.
So as you can see here, there's no preference, but particularly for the basic science projects, you need to clearly link it to human health and disease. Many investigators these days have translational components to their research, but you, for this award, need to really make that very clear. There's multiple places in the grant where that can be done. However, there's certainly no bias against basic science, And in fact, many of the investigators who've been funded are doing laboratory-based research. However, we don't discourage any investigator from basic to clinical research or population science and behavioral research from applying.
Thank you. Next question, what is the length maximum on reference letters?
Well, I'll handle that. We tried not to put a maximum length on letters, although those of us who read these letters of recommendation generally expect that within 2 pages, a letter writer should be able to provide us with the information. So we suggest keeping the letters at 2 pages or less, but if the letter runs over into a 3rd page, we'd certainly accept it. A 5-page letter may actually work against the investigator, so we would ask that they be kept to 2 pages if possible. Okay.
Next question, should these letters focus on the science or the applicant?
So as you can see, our written answer here, ideally both. If they know your science, but because they've read your papers, but they don't know you personally, that would be fine. But they would have to then be very familiar with the science and or you. The ideal letter writer would be familiar with both.
And actually, that brings up a good point. The evaluation of these applications are an evaluation of both the individual and their science. It is not like a typical NIH R01 evaluation where it's really the science that's most important. Here, where these awards are designed to accelerate the career of an early stage investigator. So we judge these applications on both the investigator's track record, their passion and commitment, their prior productivity, and the letters which state their promise and future directions, as well as how scientifically sound the proposal is. So just remember that both of those are important components for the review committee to make the recommendations for funding.
Okay, and before we move on, Jim, if we can stay on the letters, I have a couple side questions. The first one is, can the mentor letter be a combined letter from 2 mentors? And is there a page limit if you did that?
It can be a combined letter. So if you have co-mentors, then a combined letter from both of them would be fine. There's no page limit per se. I think that what you just heard from Ron would still apply. I think that people, if they produce a 5 or 6 page co-mentored letter, you're going to annoy the reviewer. So I would try and keep it to the 2 to 3 page level, if at all possible.
Okay.
And don't get there just by making it really small font either.
And a second kind of related question, if my division chair is also my primary mentor, is it better to get the chair letter from my department chair?
Well, I would say the answer is yes. You need a primary mentor letter, and the department chair can certainly write the letter that talks about the commitment to you. As a matter of fact, the department chair, frequently their letter carries more weight than your division chair when it comes to the institution's commitment already to your career. But I would agree that if your division chief is your mentor, it's probably better to have the department chair write the department letter. What we don't want is the same person to write 2 letters.
Okay, next slide, Jim. Is it important to list my career goals?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yes. remember that this award is specifically intended to identify people who the award is going to assist them in achieving their career goals. And we actually ask the reviewers to specifically review that basis. So you really got to tell us what you expect to achieve in your career and how this project will help you do that.
Okay, thank you. Is eligibility related to independent grants at the time of submission?
Absolutely. And again, we stress that the Boettcher Foundation has established a cutoff of $125,000. And if that grant is received before May 1st, then you will no longer be eligible. Again, if the grant has been submitted, but it's pending and you don't know if it's going to be funded, by all means, apply for the Boettcher Webb-Waring Award, with the proviso that if you get the other grant, you'll have to either withdraw your application or it will become ineligible. And if you find out before the review panel date that you did receive, and this is not you're told you will receive, it's you have received your notice of grant award, we suggest you should withdraw your application, since there's really no purpose in our reviewers spending their time reviewing your application if it's no longer eligible. But after our review panel, that's in April, if you are funded before May 1st, you'll become ineligible.
Okay,
and I believe this has happened once. It's not a common finding for you to get awarded right between these dates.
Okay, and then before we move on, a couple of side questions. Number one, does an R21 make you ineligible if it's greater than 125,000?
Yes. Annual.
Okay.
So if it was an R21 that had 150,000 direct costs in year one, then that would be ineligible.
Okay. And then second question, regarding the $125,000 criteria, K23, K01, or early career awards offer 50,000 in direct cost per year, or 250,000 during the duration of the award. Is the 125K a per year amount or for the lifetime of the award?
It's a per year amount. So if you have 5 years of support at 50K a year, you would still be eligible.
Okay, next slide, Jim. And we'll get into some of the questions coming in. The first one is, are there research priorities that the award is interested in?
Well, the research priorities are really something that will transform human health in some way. It doesn't have to transform human health at the time that you're doing your research, particularly if it's more of a preclinical basic science grant, but it has to relate to human health. And we don't specify a certain area of human health, a certain branch of biology, a certain branch of medicine. This could be an engineering grant, for instance, that looked at a device that would enhance human health. So there really are no other research priorities other than it must be something that eventually can be translated into improving human health.
And I would just add, Ron, that can be both preventing disease and treating disease. And so a grant that was focused on prevention would meet these criteria.
Yes, absolutely. And again, if it's a preclinical grant, you don't have to propose that your preclinical findings are going to instantaneously result in a treatment. Most of us who review the grants would say that that doesn't really make sense. So limit your proposal to what the results are going to be of your research, but link it to human health.
Thank you. Next question. If I'm on a co-PI on a major grant with more senior lead PI, how does that affect my eligibility?
So
For example,
you have to be the PI on the grant that's $125,000 or more. The exception is if you are part of a program project grant and you are running an individual project and your a budget is more than $125,000 of direct costs, that should also make you ineligible. But you can be a co-investigator, for instance, on your mentor's larger grant, yet the grant is awarded to your mentor or to a collaborator, but you're just a co-investigator. Andrew, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes. However, if it was a multiple PI R01, for example,
Yes.
you would be ineligible. But if you have the title principal investigator, you're ineligible. If you have any other title, then our reading of the rules would be that you would be eligible.
And just so it's clear, multiple PI is a specific NIH category where 2 or more people are designated as principal investigator, not as co-investigator. And we can send you more information if that specific issue comes up.
okay, thank you. Next question. Is there a preference from the selection committee for how the award is budgeted? I'm thinking in terms of 2 versus 3 years, support, salary support versus equipment. Does this impact selection?
Andrew, you want to take that?
It does not usually impact selection. It does not usually impact the score. However, there would be some exceptions to that. If, for example, you received little support from your department and you had to use this to buy the required equipment that's needed to carry out basic aspects of your research, reviewers might well question the department commitment to supporting your research career. So there's no specific problem with however you want to propose to spend the money, but be aware of more subtle things like that.
I might also say that frequently applicants do put a modest proportion of their salary support on this grant. But if you were to put all of the support to support your salary, there'd be a great question as to what your department's commitment is to you for your early stage of your career. So once again, a portion of your salary on this grant is probably okay. All of it would be frowned upon.
Okay, thank you. Another kind of budget related one. Can I include for the study an expensive piece of equipment that I have not bought yet? If I get the award, I would buy it.
Well, I would say Andrew kind of answered that. A lot depends on what expensive is. If it was a $200,000 piece of equipment, once again, I think we'd be concerned that there's no expertise in using that equipment and it's not something already used on campus. These are not equipment grants. So I think that would be frowned upon. Small pieces of equipment are certainly acceptable. I don't know, Andrew, if you have any other comments?
Yeah, I think that there's no, I know this is going to be unsatisfying to the questioner. There's no specific cutoff. So you have to use your judgment and the reviewers will also use their judgment. But I think that small pieces of equipment, totally fine. You have to buy some iPads because you're going to do a study with human patients where they're going to answer questions and do cognitive tests on an iPad. then that might be fine. But if you're asking for a $200,000 microscope, the reviewers would wonder why your department did not provide that money as part of your startup funds.
Okay, thank you. Question on whether this grant would make them ineligible. We received a grant from the Colorado Office of Economic Development, totaling approximately $130,000 in direct costs, but a $25,000 portion is for business expenses only. So approximately $105K for R&D. The application was also not included in a competition against other applications. So I'm not sure if it would count as major or competitive. Thoughts on whether this grant would make them ineligible?
I don't know exactly what business expenses mean. I think this should be taken offline. And if you have a question about this, to submit it to the website we showed you, and we would probably ask to see the budget and really understand a little bit better what type of a grant this is. And if this is really not as much a research grant as a development or program development grant, then it could be considered eligible. But I think we need a bit more detail. Don't you agree, Andrew?
Yeah, so provide us with a little bit more detail on the website that Dan showed you, and then either Ron or I can talk to you offline and we can investigate a little bit more.
Okay, so I think we're caught up on questions, so we'll give everyone kind of a last call if you have any additional questions for Ron or Andrew.
And Dan, questions can be submitted after the webinar through that email address, correct?
Correct, yep.
And we'll be happy to answer them. Okay, it looks like perhaps the questions have all been answered.
So I think we're caught up on questions. We have a couple comments thanking you, Ron and Andrew, for the webinar. It was very helpful. I will add my thanks to Dr. Sokol and Dr. Thorburn for their time today. We want to thank all of you for your interest in the program. And as Ron mentioned earlier, in the next couple days, you'll receive a follow-up email that will provide a link to today's webinar recording, and the slides will also be out there. We'll also update the FAQs and give you a link to the answers to the questions that we went through today. And then finally, it'll include a link to a very brief participant survey to provide feedback on today's session. Your feedback is really important as we plan for next year's and future webinars. And with that, that will, let me just check the questions one more time. I have a couple late questions. One is, if awarded this award and lucky enough to get another, can there be an overlap in the science?
So if one is awarded this award and then following this award, you get a competitive grant over $125,000, then this award will be in place. You should have in your application for another award issues of overlap in science. We've never had to address overlap after these awards were given, but the follow-on award, you may need to address overlap. So I think that should be fine. It's not recommended that you ever submit two grants, though, for the same science, unless they're submitted at the exact same time and you don't know which one will be funded. If you were funded for a grant under $125,000 that was the exact same science as the Boettcher Award, then we would want to look at that carefully, particularly if it's a federal award.
And I would add one thing, that remember that most of these awards are really helping you develop stronger preliminary data that is going to in turn help you get a subsequent larger grant, usually from the NIH. So normally this is not a problem that we see much of.
One other thing I wanted to mention, this award, if you do receive it, you can divide it any way you want over the 3 years. It does not have to be an equal dollar amount each year, but the budget should be justified for each of the 3 years or 2 years based on what the expenses will be during those years.
Great, thank you for doing that. So with that, I think that concludes the webinar. We've no more questions. We want to thank all the participants. Please stay safe and all the best in your future. Thank you.